Hello everyone, and welcome to Office Hours, the follow-up to Unit Design 101, where I answer comments and questions that you have, as well as talk about things that didn't make the cut for the Unit Design 101. This week's episode on hybrid units got a lot of comments, so I'm going to go over a few of the more common points that drew my attention. I won't be making a tier list of hybrid units in this video, as that gets real messy real quick, especially when most hybrid classes are promoted classes that a lot of non-hybrid units can go into. So let's just get into the comments right away. First of all, I had a lot of comments talking about magical weapons, the Levin sword and whatnot, and how hybrid units are just better users of magic weapons than physical units. And I think this is a very interesting take. I kind of wonder where this comes from in terms of, well, when you're talking hybrid weapons, I guess what's your assumption of a hybrid class? What does that mean? Because I can see a number of ways in which, okay, you have a unit that is a hybrid unit, which has like decent strength and decent magic, and in which case they can use a magical weapon quite well. Magical weapons are in many ways designed for these sorts of units, especially because magical weapons often have higher base might than a lot of physical weapons do, and that higher base might is intended to kind of make up some level of the difference between like physical units with not much magic, so they can at least deal some damage. But over time, as more and more enemies got higher and higher resistance across the board, that usefulness ended up just becoming less and less useful and important overall. And so the question then becomes, okay, does the hybrid unit have to have the ability to use tomes as well? And if they have the ability to use tomes, why are they using a Levin sword instead? I find that in cases where you have a unit with high magic that is in a class with physical weapons, so maybe their physical weapon rank is higher, and thus they don't have access to like better tomes than a basic fire or wind tome or something, and so they have a Levin sword which has significantly higher damage, and maybe that's a better use for them. Or maybe they're a class that doesn't have, or maybe they have to be reclassed in order to get tome access, and so you can just give them a magical weapon to make good use of their higher magic stat. I'm thinking Anna in Engage, where she has a personal 50% magic growth despite starting in the fighter class, Axe Fighter. And so while you would have to use an emblem to teach her tome proficiency and then reclass into a mage or a sage or whatnot in order to have tomes, what you could do instead is you could just give her a Gale Axe or Radiant Bow, or promote her into like a sword wielding class and give her a Levin sword or something like that, and then she's able to use her magic rank with otherwise physical weapons, and then those kind of become her default best weapons. I know that in my first run of Engage, I had Anna as a bow knight using a radiant bow, and that seemed to work out pretty well. But is that a hybrid unit? I guess maybe there's the question there, because I think in that case, what we're talking about is hybrid units are units with both strength and magic, but not necessarily in classes that have tome access, which kind of brings up another point that the comments mentioned very frequently, which is that hybrid units generally are better off using magic mostly across the board, which I think, depending on, again, your definition of hybrid units, that can be very true. I think that there's oftentimes, if you're assuming a unit that has pretty good strength and pretty good magic, you're usually better off using that magic than you are using that strength, because there are so many other units and unit classes that have higher strength. And in general, while resistance has increased across the board for most units as time has gone on from Fire Emblem, still most units will have generally lower resistance than defense unless they are a mage or a cleric, or they are a unit that is specifically an equal split defense, like some paladins and mage knights have an enemy. I'm thinking of Engage as well again. So a lot of times, if this is the situation, you find people using hybrid units as basically mages, but they don't use tomes, they use magical weapons instead. And so by the definition of hybrid unit being a unit with good strength and magic, the strength ends up being kind of underused, or only used when you are saving uses of a magic weapon, or to get to the rank of a magic weapon, or before you can purchase an extra magic weapon, or something like that, something to that effect, or until you can reclass them into a mage to use a tome. And so I do agree that oftentimes magic tends to be the more highlighted feature of a hybrid unit, but the other question then is, what about hybrid classes? What about classes that can use both magical and physical weapons, both tomes and lances or swords or axes or what have you? I think that then bears mentioning, because the types of units that can enter into those more hybrid classes are not always magic users. Like in my example with Cordelia, I literally watched a friend in their first time playing through Engage promote Cordelia into Darkflyer, and then with having like 6 or 8 magic compared to 20 something strength, use fire because, oh, I'm using fire against a general because the general has higher defense than resistance, right? But then fire was only dealing like 7 or 8 damage when, sure, an iron lance or a javelin might have dealt similar amounts, but if you used like a steel or silver lance, which you had the ranks to, you would have been dealing significantly more. And it was just kind of really head scratching of, why is this happening? Well, it's because, yeah, you have a unit that can use magic, but they really are not built to, and so they shouldn't be using magic, even though they are in a class that allows them to. And so I think that global assumption of if it's a hybrid unit, then they are better off using magic all the time is false, but I do agree that that probably depends on the definition of hybrid unit that you're using. Another comment that I got, speaking of which, is that people were assuming a different definition of the term hybrid. They were assuming a utility hybrid, like a combat staff unit or a combat thief, something like that. Something like you're thinking of an assassin like a Volk or a Jafar, or you're thinking of like a war cleric like Libra or a promoted Lissa. And while I agree that that is definitely a definition of hybrid and something that I wanted to talk about, that's something that I felt couldn't really fit into the video while still having the same arc. And so I'll talk a little bit about utility hybrids as well here. I think the ability to give a unit that is primarily utility an effective combat option, not just situational combat or token combat like dancers often get or certain clerics get sometimes, but meaningful combat, is very interesting, but also runs into a problem of, well, what's your primary use for the unit, and are you going to actually give them that secondary usefulness? Something that often comes up with mages promoting into sages is that, well, if you're using a unit primarily for magic, primarily for combat, and then you promote them and you give them access to staves, how good are staves in this game? Because if you fully transition the unit into, I'm always using magic, that's the only thing I can do, into, now I can use staves, so I'm pretty much only using staves, that feels like a really weird transformation. Someone in one of the comments mentioned that they treat Asbel in this way in Thracia. And while I personally don't agree with that being the best use of Asbel, I understand the desire to have more staff wielders in Thracia, because staves are busted in Thracia, especially once you get to higher staff ranks. On the other hand, you have games where you promote your mage into a sage, and then, yeah, you get like an E rank heal staff, so you're occasionally healing a unit when you have nothing else to do, or when that unit was about to die or something, but generally you're still using them for magical attacks. And this will vary from player to player and vary from game to game all the time, of course, but it is something to kind of take note of sometimes when you give utility to a unit, it increases the desire for a player to use them, but also sometimes when you give utility to a unit, it splits the focus on what the unit is actually doing. Which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to keep in mind, because some people will see extra utility as generally a positive. Good news, good thing. Other people will see, well, now they have, a staff rank, so obviously I want to train their staff rank, but it's such a low staff rank, it takes so long to get them leveled to the point of being able to use any good staves, it's just tedious. Why even bother having the staff rank? And this is where you get the division between classes like Sage and Sorcerer. Sorcerer gets the dark magic access in like Awakening or Fates, but doesn't get staves, whereas Sage or Onmyoji in Fates does have, if I remember right, staves as well as tome access, which then provides that interesting little dynamic of, do you want to have better utility options? Whether or not you're going to use that utility, do you want to have the option of utility, or do you just want to have a little bit more raw power? You also find this in Pegasus Knights in Engage, where you can either become a Wyvern Knight and have better strength and defense, or you can become a Griffin Knight and have staff access and better speed, I think. It's not the only thing there. Wyvern Knight gets 2 different weapons. They have different skills. There are differences, obviously, but the question becomes, do you want to have a unit that's focused on combat and kind of gains a little bit better combat stats, versus do you want to give that utility to the unit instead? And what should that utility cost relative to not having that utility? I think in games with branching promotions or in games with reclassing, that is an important question to ask, because if you can control what a unit will get on promotion, you are more likely to weigh those costs and effects and really think about the cost of getting utility versus the opportunity cost of going for power over utility. And I think that's something that's interesting and can be studied or talked about in detail, possibly in a later video. But again, if that's a type of hybrid you wanted to talk about, I think there is definitely some room for that. As for like combat and thief hybrid, like thief utility, a combat thief, I don't feel like that's generally been done particularly well. Like, we have Soth and Radiant Dawn, and arguably Heather and Radiant Dawn as well, which I think have done the best so far, but even then it's like, okay, your combat utility, because you are using a weapon type that has generally pretty low might, you have to have significantly higher stats to make up for that. And then as soon as enemies start meeting your stats and other units that you have start meeting those stats, your combat prowess starts to just decline and not really go anywhere because your base weapon type is significantly weaker. I think that as you make that weapon type stronger, you give almost too much credence to the unit, at which point it just becomes a different style of fighter. I think I talked about this in my Thief episode, where like ninjas in Fates and then thieves in Engage lost a lot of their non-combat utility. Like, they have lock touch in Fates still, and I think there's some other stuff they can do. Like, they can debuff, but generally they're just fast, decently strong combat units which have 1-2 range at very few weapon penalties, whereas other units, like, unless you're it's like mages and ninjas, hidden weapons have 1-2 range with very few combat penalties. Other weapons in Fates particularly have penalties for 1-2 range. You can't multi-attack. Like, you can't, not multi-attack, you can't double with them, and you were significantly slowed by them. And so it then became, okay, well, ninjas and to a lesser extent butlers, which, speaking of a utility hybrid, become these units that have the ability to just fight kind of whoever, whatever, whenever. And so you have very strong benefits from a dodgy, fast ninja like Kaze, or even just like a strong, more bulky ninja like Saizo. And they become combat units whose utility in being able to open doors is almost just like a nice to have, but you almost forget that it exists most of the time. which got to a point in Engage where they just made anyone able to open chests. I forget if Lock Touch even exists or has a purpose, if there are doors you need keys to open or something like that. But they basically decided, no, we're not going to worry about having utility that way. I think Thieves have extra vision, but if I remember right, the data mine of Engage was that every unit just has a different vision stat, and that there was the ability that they could have had to increase or decrease or give a vision growth or something, but they just didn't do that. I forget exactly how it worked out, but it was something to that effect. Anyway, needless to say, I don't think that Thief utility has necessarily gone over super well in regards to combat Thief, where you either make a Thief unit that has very situational combat or combat that only works for a certain period of the game, or you make a unit that is basically just a great combat unit that happens to have some utility with them as well, which maybe determines a little bit. Having some Thief utility on a strong combat unit can determine on what maps you deploy them and how you deploy them, like where you send them. You're going to send them certain routes. You're going to send them ahead of your army to scout in Fog of War maps. You're going to send them to treasure rooms or to locked doors in castle maps. Stuff like that. And so it determines how you use the unit on a map more so than it really changes how you use the unit in other ways or on maps that have less to do with that. But that's the Thief problem in a nutshell, is that Thief utility is only as good as the maps allow, or only as necessary even as the maps kind of allow. So that's kind of that point on utility hybrids. Someone made a comment, which happens to be the most upvoted comment on the video: the strength of hybrid classes is not having both strength and magic, but rather having both defense and res. Which is a very interesting way of putting it. Okay, I responded to that comment by saying, so the Paladin is the best hybrid unit class then. But I think what they meant might be considered hybrid being just a physically bulky mage, like a mage that doesn't fall over to any sort of physical attack, which definitely is a benefit. I mean, don't get me wrong, Mage Knight and Dark Knight and whatnot can be very strong classes, in part because the strength of having a bulky mage is not to be underestimated. Nosferatu tanking doesn't work if you're getting one shot, but if you can survive a hit and hit back with Nosferatu to heal back all that damage, you have a unit build going on. And so I think that there's definitely some merit to that comment. It's just a very interesting way of phrasing it that I didn't really think about beforehand. So actually, now that I think about it, thanks for the comment. That was really, really interesting. And aside from that, there were just a lot of comments on various suggestions for maybe how to make hybrids or how to make hybrid promotions work better. In theory, people are saying, well, give a unit like +6 or +8 to their other stats if they go into a hybrid class or stuff like that. I find that there's just a lot of like stat fixing and stat discussion there. There were some comments and discussions on the numbers that I used in the video, and yes, I did pull those numbers kind of out of a hat, just out of nowhere, but I think that the intent with the numbers, more so than the literal numbers used, was just to kind of showcase, okay, no, there is a significant difference between a hybrid unit and a dedicated strength unit or a dedicated mage. And sometimes that difference isn't super noticeable, but sometimes it is incredibly noticeable. Engage, for instance, Fire Emblem Engage, on Maddening in particular, I find that even my most magically strong units are constantly barely at the point of one-shotting enemies. Like I had in my most recent Maddening run, Anna as a Mage Knight, Ivy as her unique class, and Citrine as a Sage. And I found, so Citrine I was using Olwyn and Thunder and like a Forged Thunder Tome and everything, but I had to constantly make sure that she was leveling up, leveling magic, and even give her some magic stat boosters just to keep her at the point where she was one-shotting enemies, because that line was just so fine, And as the enemy hit points increased, she had to in turn increase her magic to match it. And if she had any less magic than what she had, which was the most magic I could possibly give her with a very improved lightning tome and the class with the most magic growth and everything, she was barely keeping up. And she was getting a very significant number of kills. Like, I was not like just using her 1 or 2 kills. She was like constantly MVP in that run because she was just my delete button. But I had to keep training her, and I had to keep leveling her up, and I had to keep giving her these things in order to maintain her being that delete button, because otherwise she would fall behind. And any other unit that had a weaker magic stat would not have been able to perform that role. Like, for instance, had I given Olwyn and the Forged Thunder Tome to Clan, for instance, he would not be anywhere near as good as Citrine in that particular role. Granted, this also was because I was using the Olwyn Thunder build, and that was something that, well, Mage Knight Anna didn't have a problem because I was able to give her like a Forged Bolganone. And that had it well beyond the might that she needed to effectively damage. It then became more about speed fixing her so she could double. And that was pretty easily solved with like Speed Plus and Speed Taker from Lyn. Anyway, the point is that if you have a unit that is not as good in a magic stat, in a combat stat, as a unit, even just by a couple of points, like it didn't have to be 15 to 25, it could have been 20 to 25, and the difference still would have made a difference, at least in high difficulty games. I think when you're talking about normal or hard difficulty, then that difference is not super noticeable. It might be the difference between 1 rounding and 2 rounding, but that's not always as big of an issue. But if you're playing in very high difficulties, particularly maddening mode and like 3 houses are engaged, you want your offensive focused units to be one-shot glass cannons. Like, you want your glass cannons to be one-shotters. You don't want them taking a hit back. You don't want them taking more than 1 turn or more than 1 attack to defeat an enemy, because that risks them immediately dying, because the stat and the enemy quality in terms of stats is just so much higher. And I think that that is something that maybe I could have done a better job to highlight, of the difference doesn't have to be a full 10-point swing in a promoted unit situation, but even a 5-point or 3-point swing can be very significant in the right circumstances. That was kind of more my point on that. Other than that, there wasn't really a lot of other comments on this video, but if you have any other comments that you want answered, go into the comment section down below and I'll try to type out my responses there, or go into the Discord, link in the description, and talk away. I talk a little bit about how I do things, I talk about what videos are coming next, and sometimes I bounce ideas off my community, so if you want to join in, be there, have fun. Other than that, I did want to give a shout out to the LaguzGuard members who keep this channel afloat, in particular the Royal LaguzGuard member, the Forgotten L, and the LaguzGuard members C2 Pikali, Enigmatic Mr. L, Mad Moke, Bro Duderman, Kumi, Miss Mesmerism, Lakag, Relaz6, Sal Melon, and Inside Chaos. If I'm mispronouncing any of your names, please send a message and correct me. Until next time though, this is Mithril Zenith signing out.